August 1st, 2026. Right now, forecasters are telling Texas something that sounds almost contradictory, and that's exactly why it's the story you need to hear today. The official numbers say this hurricane season should be quiet, one of the calmest in years, thanks to a strengthening El Niño pattern working against storm development. And yet, some of the exact same meteorologists issuing that forecast are also saying they're more worried this year than they've been in a long time. Not because more storms are coming, but because the water sitting in the Gulf of Mexico right now is so unusually warm that any storm that does manage to form has the fuel to explode in strength. Within hours, sometimes overnight, catching entire coastal communities off guard with almost no time to prepare. Texas has already felt the opening notes of this pattern once this year. So today, we're breaking down exactly why a below-average forecast can still add up to one of the most dangerous setups Texas has faced in years, what rapid intensification actually is, and why it terrifies hurricane scientists more than raw storm counts ever could, how Texas's own hurricane history backs up exactly this kind of warning, and what meteorologists are specifically watching for as we move deeper into the peak of the season. Before we get into it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap that bell icon so you get notified the second a new system starts spinning up in the Gulf, because based on everything we're about to cover, you're going to want that warning as early as possible. Drop a comment right now. If you live along the Gulf Coast in Texas or anywhere else, tell me how you personally prepare. Each year, do you have a go bag ready, a plan for your family, or are you someone who waits until a storm actually has a name before you start paying attention? I want to hear the honest answer, because by the end of this video, you might think about that timeline a little differently. Now let's get into what's actually happening. Let's start with the official numbers, because they matter, even if they don't tell the whole story on their own. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's outlook for this Atlantic hurricane season puts the odds at 55% for a below normal season, 35% for something close to average, and just 10% for an above normal season. Colorado State University's widely followed forecast, updated in early July, actually lowered its numbers for the second consecutive month, now calling for 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and just 1 major hurricane across the entire Atlantic basin this year, down from the 11 named storms, 5 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes the same team had projected back in June. AccuWeather's independent forecast landed in a similar range, 11 to 16 named storms total, with 3 to 5 expected to make direct impacts somewhere in the United States. Every single one of these forecasting groups points to the same underlying cause, a strong, strengthening El Niño pattern developing across the tropical Pacific. When water temperatures near the equator in the eastern Pacific warm significantly above their long-term average, it doesn't just affect the Pacific, it reshapes wind patterns across the entire globe, and one of the most consistent effects is increased wind shear across the Atlantic basin. Wind shear is essentially a change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes, and for a hurricane trying to organize and strengthen, that kind of shear acts almost like a hand physically tilting and disrupting the storm's structure before it can fully build itself into something dangerous. Strong shear makes it measurably harder for tropical systems to form in the first place, and even harder for the ones that do form to intensify into major hurricanes. Researchers behind this year's forecast said outright that they've reduced their storm count numbers specifically because of increased confidence that a strong, or even very strong, El Niño will dominate the tropical Atlantic through the traditional peak of hurricane season, expecting total named storm activity to run somewhere around 40 to 45% of the long-term average, a genuinely significant reduction. It's worth briefly understanding why a Pacific Ocean pattern thousands of miles from the Gulf of Mexico has this much influence over whether a hurricane forms near Texas at all. El Niño describes a periodic, naturally occurring warming of surface waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. When those waters warm significantly above their typical range, the entire atmosphere above that stretch of ocean responds, shifting the position and strength of major wind currents that circle the globe. One of the most consistent downstream effects of a strong El Niño is an increase in upper-level westerly winds stretching across the tropical Atlantic, exactly the kind of wind shear that disrupts a young tropical storm structure before it has a chance to fully organize into something dangerous. This is precisely why forecasters watch El Niño so closely every single year when building their seasonal hurricane outlooks, because it's one of the single strongest predictors available for how active or quiet an Atlantic season is likely to be, even though it can't tell you in April exactly where any individual storm that does form will eventually make landfall. And when it comes to Texas specifically, the geographic breakdown makes the state's position look even more reassuring on paper. AccuWeather's forecast identifies the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast, along with the Carolinas, as the areas facing the greatest risk of direct Impacts this year based on patterns observed during past seasons with similar atmospheric setups, specifically 2009, 2014, 2018, and 2023. Texas, by contrast, and specifically central and southern Texas, is explicitly flagged as facing a lower level of risk this season compared to those other regions. If you stop the story right there, the takeaway would be simple: quieter season overall, and Texas specifically sitting in a relatively lower risk zone within that quieter season. Good news, right? Except that every single hurricane expert quoted across every one of these forecasts adds the exact same caveat immediately afterward, and it's worth actually sitting with why they keep repeating it so insistently rather than letting the reassuring headline number stand on its own. AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert Alex De Silva put it directly, saying it's critically important that everyone from South Texas, all the way up to Maine, prepares equally for every single hurricane season, regardless of what the official seasonal forecast says, because even a season expected to run below average can still produce major hits across the United States. The National Hurricane Center's own Michael Rome offered a nearly identical warning, cautioning people not to underestimate the potential power of this year's storm season just because El Niño is expected to limit the total number of storms that form. And the reason these officials keep hammering this point isn't just professional caution. It's backed by hurricane history in a way that should genuinely make anyone along the Gulf Coast pay attention. The 1992 Atlantic hurricane season produced only 7 named storms total, a genuinely quiet season by any measure. One of those 7 storms was Hurricane Andrew, which went on to become one of the most destructive hurricanes in United States history, flattening large sections of South Florida and reshaping how the entire country thinks about hurricane preparedness and building codes to this day. And Texas has its own recent example of exactly this pattern playing out. Back in 2023, another season that finished with below-average overall storm numbers, one of the only storms to actually make landfall in the United States that entire year was Tropical Storm Harold, which came ashore directly on the southern Texas coast. Texas's own hurricane history goes well beyond that single example, and it's worth walking through a couple of the state's most consequential storms to understand exactly what's at stake when experts warn that it only takes one. In August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey made landfall along the Texas coast near Rockport as a powerful Category 4 storm, but it wasn't the wind that made Harvey one of the costliest disasters in American history. It was what happened after landfall, when the storm essentially stalled over southeast Texas for days, dumping historic, record-breaking rainfall across the Houston metropolitan area. Some locations recorded over 50 inches of rain in a matter of days. Catastrophic, unprecedented flooding that displaced tens of thousands of people, damaged well over 100,000 homes, and ultimately caused well over $100 billion in damage, making it one of the costliest tropical cyclones on record for the entire country. 9 years before that, in September of 2008, Hurricane Ike struck the upper Texas coast near Galveston as a large, powerful storm, driving a devastating storm surge that inundated Galveston Island and the surrounding Bolivar Peninsula, ultimately causing dozens of direct deaths in Texas and tens of billions of dollars in damage across the region. Neither Harvey's season nor Ike's season stands out in hurricane record books as an especially hyperactive year by storm count alone. What both of those disasters actually demonstrate, in the clearest possible terms, is that the total number of named storms an Atlantic season produces has almost no bearing on whether the single storm that does eventually turn toward Texas ends up being genuinely historic and catastrophic for the communities in its path. Here's where this year's story gets genuinely more specific and, frankly, more concerning than a simple repeat of past history. The single biggest concern hurricane forecasters are voicing this year isn't about how many storms will form. It's about how fast the storms that do form could intensify once they get going, a phenomenon meteorologists call rapid intensification. De Silva was blunt about it, saying this year forecasters are very concerned about rapid intensification, describing it as very similar to what's been observed over the past couple of years. Rapid intensification has a specific technical definition in meteorology, an increase in a tropical cyclone's maximum sustained winds of at least 35 miles an hour within a 24-hour period. That number might not sound dramatic on its own, but translate it into what it actually means for a coastal community, and it becomes genuinely alarming. A storm that looks like a modest tropical storm on Tuesday evening, generating maybe a day or two of preparation time and a relatively low sense of urgency, can wake up Wednesday morning as a major, Category 3 or higher hurricane, with wind speeds that have jumped by well over 30 miles an hour overnight, while most of the coastline was asleep. That compresses the entire decision-making window for evacuation, boarding up homes and stocking emergency supplies into a fraction of the time people are used to having, and it's exactly the scenario that turns a manageable evacuation into a genuinely dangerous scramble. The reason forecasters are so specifically worried about this mechanism right now comes down to water, and not just the surface temperature you'd see reported in a typical weather forecast. De Silva emphasized that the concern isn't only about how warm the water is at the very surface of the ocean, it's about something called ocean heat content, meaning how much of that warmth extends down below the surface as well. He described the water across most of the hurricane basin as exceptionally warm, not just at the surface, but hundreds of feet deep, which matters enormously for storm intensity because a hurricane's engine draws energy from warm ocean water as it churns across it. If a storm only has warm water sitting in a thin surface layer, its own turbulence can actually pull cooler water up from below, naturally limiting how strong it can get, almost like the storm cools its own fuel supply as it works. But when that warmth extends hundreds of feet down, there's no cooler water close enough to the surface to pull up and slow the process, meaning the storm can keep drawing on nearly unlimited fuel and intensifying rapidly with essentially nothing to check that growth. Jeff Berardelli, a chief meteorologist and climate specialist who's tracked this closely, described the Gulf specifically as high-octane water for any storm right now, precisely because it's running warmer than normal, and this isn't a one-year anomaly. Disconnected from anything else, sea surface temperatures across hurricane-forming regions have trended warmer over recent decades in large part because the oceans have absorbed the overwhelming majority of the additional heat, trapped by planet-warming pollution from burning oil, gas, and coal. Phil Klotzbach, the lead scientist behind Colorado State University's seasonal forecast, has noted that over the past 30 years, even as the total number of hurricanes forming each season has actually trended slightly downward, the percentage of storms reaching the most powerful Category 4 and 5 strength has measurably increased. Fewer storms overall, but a larger share of the ones that do form reaching genuinely catastrophic intensity. That's precisely the dynamic driving this year's warnings. A below-average storm count sitting on top of above-average fuel for the storms that do manage to form. It helps to actually understand what these category numbers mean in practical terms, because the jump between categories on the Saffir-Simpson scale isn't a simple, even progression. It's another example of a scale where each step up represents a dramatically larger jump in destructive potential than the numbers alone suggest. A Category 1 hurricane, with sustained winds starting at 74 miles an hour, can strip roof shingles and topple tree branches, producing what's generally described as dangerous but comparatively limited damage. By the time a storm reaches Category 3, with sustained winds of at least 111 miles an hour, and crosses into what the National Hurricane Center classifies as a major hurricane, well-built framed homes can sustain major damage, and by Category 4, at 130 miles an hour and above, well-constructed homes can lose most of their roof structure entirely, with the surrounding area left uninhabitable for weeks or months afterward. But wind alone is often not even the deadliest part of a major hurricane making landfall along the Gulf Coast specifically. Storm. Surge. The abnormal rise of ocean water pushed ashore ahead of and during a hurricane's landfall has historically been responsible for the majority of hurricane-related deaths in the United States. And it's driven not just by a storm's wind speed, but by its size, its forward speed, the angle at which it approaches the coast, and the shape of the seafloor and coastline it's approaching, which is exactly why a hurricane's Saffir-Simpson category, which is based purely on wind speed, doesn't always perfectly predict how dangerous its storm surge will actually be, a nuance the National Hurricane Center specifically built separate storm surge warning products to address in recent years. Texas has already gotten a preview of exactly how quickly this basin can spin up a storm this year, even in a season forecasters keep describing as quiet. Back in June, an area of low pressure sitting near the Texas-Mexico border drifted back out over the warm waters of the northwestern Gulf, and meteorologists watched conditions there become conducive enough for rapid organization almost immediately. That system strengthened into Tropical Storm Arthur, the first-named storm of the entire 2026 Atlantic season, developing just offshore of southeast Texas with sustained winds reaching 40 miles an hour. A tropical storm warning went into effect for coastal Brazoria, Galveston, and all of Chambers County, with the primary threats being tropical storm force winds capable of minor property damage and power outages right along the coastline, along with heavy rain carrying a genuine flooding risk. Meteorologists covering that storm made a point of noting that regardless of whether the system officially earned a name, the actual impacts on the ground for residents in Texas and Louisiana would be effectively identical. A reminder that the name and category assigned to a storm matter far less to the people experiencing it than the wind, rain, and surge actually arriving at their doorstep. Then, just weeks later in July, Tropical Storm Bertha formed as the season's second named storm and tracked directly along the northern Gulf coast for several days, bringing storm surge as high as 4 feet and sustained winds up to 50 miles an hour to communities along that stretch of coastline. Forecasters didn't expect Bertha to strengthen into a full hurricane, and it didn't. But the National Hurricane Center's own messaging around that storm reinforced exactly the same point being made all season, that warmer than normal Atlantic waters mean the risk of a genuinely destructive storm remains high, even while the season's overall pace stays below average. So here's the actual honest picture as of today, the 1st of August, sitting right at the entrance to what's traditionally the most active stretch of the entire hurricane season, since the Atlantic Basin's climatological peak typically runs from mid-August through October. As of the most recent tropical weather updates, the Atlantic Basin itself has been quiet, with no development expected in the Gulf, Caribbean, or wider Atlantic over the coming week, closing out July without any new tropical systems forming. That quiet stretch is entirely consistent with what the seasonal forecasts predicted, and it's worth being honest that so far this year genuinely has tracked toward the calmer end of the spectrum these models projected back in the spring. But calm right now doesn't mean calm through the rest of the season, and every meteorologist tracking this basin is explicitly framing this stretch as a pause rather than a conclusion. The same warm, deep ocean heat content that fueled Arthur's quick formation and Bertha's steady track along the coast is still sitting there, waiting for the right atmospheric trigger, whether that's a tropical wave rolling off the African coast, a disturbance organizing directly in the Gulf the way Arthur did, or a system spinning up in the Western Caribbean, any of which meteorologists specifically flag as the regions to watch most closely as the season moves into its traditional peak months. This is really the core tension worth understanding if you live anywhere along the Texas coast, or honestly, anywhere along the Gulf. The forecast for total storm numbers this year is genuinely, legitimately lower than a typical season, and Texas specifically sits in a lower relative risk category compared to the northern Gulf Coast and the Carolinas. That part of the story is real, and it's not clickbait exaggeration to say the season overall looks quieter. But quieter does not mean safer in any way. That should change how a Texas coastal resident actually prepares, and this is exactly the distinction hurricane scientists keep trying to communicate every single year, without it fully landing the way they intend. A below-average season with unusually warm, deep ocean heat sitting in the Gulf is arguably a more dangerous setup for any individual storm that does form than a busier season with more numerous but weaker systems, precisely because it takes fewer chances for something genuinely catastrophic to develop, and because rapid intensification compresses the warning time people get before that catastrophic storm arrives. It only takes one storm to define a season for the community it hits, and Texas has direct recent memory of exactly that pattern. A below-average year in 2023 that still delivered Tropical Storm Harold directly to its southern coastline, following the same broader historical precedent set by Hurricane Andrew emerging from an otherwise unremarkable 1992 season, and echoing the harder lessons of both Harvey and Ike, two of the state's most devastating storms in modern memory. So what does this actually mean for what you should do right now, today, heading into the peak months of August, September, and October? First, treat every tropical disturbance that starts organizing in the Gulf of Mexico or the Western Caribbean over the coming months with real seriousness from the moment it appears on a forecast map, rather than waiting for it to earn a name or reach hurricane strength before you start paying attention. Because, as we've covered, the entire danger of rapid intensification is that a storm can cross from minor to major faster than your normal planning timeline expects. Have your hurricane kit built and ready well before any storm is even on the radar: water, non-perishable food, medications, flashlights, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, and copies of important documents, rather than treating kit building as something you do once a watch or warning is already issued. Know your evacuation zone and your evacuation route if you live anywhere along the immediate coastline, and know it now, not during the 48 hours before a storm makes landfall, because those compressed rapid intensification timelines can turn what would normally be a comfortable multi-day evacuation window into something closer to a single day. If you're inland, but still within reach of tropical storm force winds and heavy rainfall, remember that flooding, not wind, is historically the leading cause of hurricane-related deaths in the United States, and that risk doesn't require a storm to reach hurricane strength at all, as Arthur's heavy rain and flood risk back in June demonstrated even as a relatively weak, unnamed system, and as Hurricane Harvey demonstrated on a genuinely historic scale 9 years ago, when the storm's rainfall, not its wind, produced the overwhelming majority of the damage and displacement across the Houston region. If you live directly along the coastline, pay particularly close attention to storm surge warnings specifically. Separate from the general hurricane category. since, as Hurricane Ike demonstrated at Galveston, a large storm surge can be catastrophic even when its peak sustained winds don't reach the very highest categories on the scale. Keep your phone's emergency alert settings turned on, rather than relying solely on checking a weather app manually, since wireless emergency alerts for hurricane and storm surge warnings are specifically designed to reach you even if you're not actively monitoring the news. And that automatic notification can matter enormously if a rapid intensification event compresses your available warning time down to a matter of hours rather than days. And broadly, take the advice every single hurricane forecaster quoted in this story has repeated in some form: prepare the same way every single year, regardless of what the seasonal outlook says, because the specific communities that get hit by the worst storms in any given year are rarely the ones the seasonal forecast singled out as highest risk months in advance. Stepping back from the week-to-week forecast, here's the piece of this story worth carrying with you deeper into the season. This year's Atlantic hurricane forecast is a genuinely useful tool for understanding the big picture. Fewer storms overall, driven by a strengthening El Niño increasing wind shear across the basin, and Texas sitting in a comparatively lower risk category relative to the northern Gulf Coast and Carolinas. But underneath that reassuring headline sits a genuinely different kind of risk: exceptionally warm water extending hundreds of feet below the surface across the hurricane basin, creating exactly the conditions that have fueled rapid intensification events in recent years, and that forecasters are explicitly warning about again this year. Texas has already seen two systems this season: Arthur and the broader storm activity that followed it along the coast develop and organize directly in its own backyard. A reminder that being in a lower risk category on a seasonal outlook map is not the same thing as being outside the storm's reach entirely. History, from Hurricane Andrew emerging out of a quiet 1992 season to Tropical Storm Harold making landfall in Texas during a below-average 2023, to the far more devastating lessons of Harvey's historic rainfall and Ike's catastrophic storm surge, backs up exactly what every meteorologist in this story has said in some form. It only takes one storm. And the season's overall storm count has never been a reliable predictor of whether that one storm turns toward you. We'll be tracking the Atlantic and the Gulf closely as we move deeper into the traditional peak of the season through August, September, and October, watching for exactly the kind of tropical waves and Gulf disturbances forecasters have flagged as the systems most likely to develop next. If you want to know the moment something starts organizing, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon right now, because based on everything covered in this video, the quiet stretch we're in today is not a guarantee of how the rest of this season plays out. And drop that comment below if you haven't yet. Tell me how you personally prepare each hurricane season, and whether this changes how early you'll start paying attention to a storm the next time one starts spinning up in the Gulf. See you in the next one.